Go, Mike.
Good afternoon from Barcelona. Good evening if you're in Shanghai, and good morning if you are in New York or California. And good day to you if you're anywhere else in the world. This is Mike Rosenberg from IESE Business School. If you don't know me, I'm a professor of strategy here at the business school, and this is it's just a pleasure for me to welcome you to another one of our series of webinars on the topic of how to manage in these very difficult times. As you can see, I'm no longer in our studio at IESE Business School. We have gone virtual. In Spain, we are under a government decreed state of alarm, which means that people should stay home when they can. So we have decided to broadcast these sessions from our houses. So I'm here in my home office, broadcasting live. Now, by the way, people see me and see the other faculty members behind the scenes. When we're doing this, there is a small army of people from the managers of our alumni association, Sylvia Johansson and Sabrina Voss and all of their colleagues. We have a tech crew. We have people scheduling this stuff. So it's really the entire IESE community has kind of come together to not only teach our classes online to our MBAs and our running programs, but also to reach out to all of you, our alumni, and everyone else in the world. These sessions are being broadcast open access here on LinkedIn. They're also on the IESE, different websites from the IESE Business School, on its YouTube channel. And I understand that La Vanguardia, the local paper here in Barcelona, is also broadcasting these or taping these and broadcasting the tapes on their website. So we're all trying to help all of you deal with the emergency and do the best you can through these complicated times. It's my pleasure today to welcome Sebastian Reiche. Sebastian is a professor in our managing people department. He's actually the department head of that department. He's got a wealth of experience in this field. And Sebastian's really been studying the issue of virtual teams for quite a long time. Virtual teams, of course, is something that we've been using increasingly in business. And these days, we're all using it even more. So with that, Sebastian, welcome to our series. How are you today?
Hi, Mike. Thanks for the introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here to talk about virtual teams. I think it's very fitting that we're starting the webinar talking about virtual teams straight from our homes to your home, Mike, and to everyone else's homes. And I guess we're all forced to be confined to our homes. I guess we're all grappling with the challenge of how can we replicate deep, high-quality, effective work in a virtual and a remote home work setting. So that's what we're going to talk about today.
Fantastic. By the way, I do have questions. I can see your questions. If I look over here, I can see the LinkedIn feed. And I also have one of our Alumni Association people actually looking for questions and bringing them to me here on my iPad here in my house. So we've got lots of ways of trying to get your interaction. And please feel free to type in your questions or your comments. I see a lot of people saying hello to each other from all over the world. So it's really a pleasure to see you all. And I'm also kind of stalling while more and more people sign up. We've got 500 people on the call right now, and we'll get a couple more, I guess, as people come to LinkedIn and come
Wonderful.
to see the webinar. Sebastian, just before we get into kind of how to make this work, how prevalent or how much have people been using working virtually before last month? If we go back to the world the way it was, what was the state of play in this space?
Mm-hmm. That's a good point, right? So if you think about virtual teams and virtual work, this is not a new phenomenon. And I thought I'll bring you some data on the world before the coronavirus. And here on that first slide, let's have a look at this slide. There's actually a survey from the Economist Intelligence Unit about a decade ago, right? So this is from 2009, and they asked about 8,000 executives in terms of whether they would be working in virtual teams or they've worked in virtual teams in the past. And 80% said that they have had some experience. And on the chart, you see a bit more detail in terms of how much and the intensity or frequency of how much executives would work in virtual teams. You see about 50%. So these are the two longest graphs here in the middle, spend between 20 to 60% of their time in virtual teams. So that's a sizable number, right? So
and these numbers, Sebastian, were from some years ago, and even then there was a few people who say that I only work on this. I
exactly.
guess there's some companies which are already totally virtual. I understand the publishers of WordPress, a software company called Automatic, has been virtual for a long time. Is that common?
It has increasingly been common. So there's some startups as well that start out completely virtual, but it's still been a minority before the last up until now. But yeah, so other companies like Oracle as well, a lot of people work, that too, can work from home and work virtually. So this is not a new phenomenon, right? So you see, this is a decade ago. We've seen this a fair bit.
And is it the same all over the world, or is there differences in different places?
So we've seen some differences. Probably in the US, you've seen that adopted more quickly. In fact, if we look at Europe more particularly, I've got another chart that I wanted to share here. You see essentially just a breakdown across 28 different European countries. Now, there's obviously a difference between virtual work and remote work. So what you see here in 3 different colors, in blue, this is regular home-based telework. So essentially what we're all doing right now, comparing these different countries to which extent or what the percentage of people regularly working from home. With a high in Denmark, about 8% to a low in Italy. Then orange, you see what we'd call mobile work using information and communication technology, using your phone, your laptop, working from public spaces, could be from home, but on the go, could be on the plane or on the train. And then in green, you see occasional mobile work using virtual means. Now,
I guess the numbers today would be radically different all over the world, yeah.
Exactly right. So I mean, the blue would be up at close to 100%, right? So if you look at this comparison, this is 2015. This would have been a drastic change. What you also see here, if you compare this to the previous chart, is telework was still much less prevalent than virtual work, right? So you might have been used to working with your team that's dispersed, even within the city or in different regions in the same country, but working from home or fully mobile is still a different story.
Wow. And so Sebastian, I know because I'm a follower of your blog, Expatrias, which is about expatriates and people living in different places. But every now and again, you do talk about virtual teams. What are the challenges facing people when they're working virtually?
Mm-hmm.
You know, again, before the virus, what does academic research say are the big issues that are at play?
Mm-hmm. So I guess it boils down to what I would call a lack of depth perception. And let's stick a bit with this metaphor. If you look at the slide, you see a scuba diver. Mike, I know that you like scuba diving too, so let's kind of use that metaphor for a bit. But now, what I mean with lack of depth perception, if you're scuba diving, if you're floating in the water, you're about to kind of glide in the water, you have your mask on, right? You have a fairly good sense of the depth of the ocean. You're swimming in the sea, you're starting to go under, you look around you so the vastness, the depth of the ocean.
And now, Sebastian, by the way, you also have a depth meter either on your hand or on your watch.
Exactly.
So if you get confused, you can always look at the number.
Exactly right. And so that's a nice point. So that's where technology can actually help you, right? But if you're only sitting in the boat and you're staring at the screen and you're trying to figure out how does it feel to be in the ocean, that doesn't quite give you the same kind of perception, right? So you can't get a sense of the depth just by looking at the meter or just by looking at the screen, right? You have to be actually in it. And so if you collaborate virtually, in a way, you're lacking that feeling, that perception of depth in the relationships in terms of how you focus in the work. So ultimately, working virtually, working remotely is trying to replicate and trying to reduce that lack that you experience just by mere fact of being virtual.
Mm-hmm. So what are the challenges? I mean, as you go into this depth perception, what do you mean by that? What is it? So can you break that down to some bits and pieces in real life?
Sure. So I'd say that there's 3 different types of distance that you essentially have to overcome, right? One is geographical or just virtual distance, the fact that you're not in the same room. And we know from research on social networks, the moment you don't meet someone on the corridor, you just nurture that relationship slightly less. Right? Or put differently, you're going to talk to the person that you meet physically more than people that are further away. So you might be talking to your neighbor right at the moment more than your colleagues. Right? The other is that, especially if your team is dispersed across different countries or regions, but literally geographic differences, you also face time zone differences.
Sure.
I thought I'd show you. You probably have seen, if you're involved in global virtual teams, there are these nice things as time difference overlap calculators. So if you're sitting in different regions or cities, you can calculate when would be a good time to talk. So here's an example: London 3 o'clock. This is the top line is our time bracket right now. Right, London would be 3 o'clock. Barcelona would be 4 in the afternoon. You've got New Delhi, Sydney, San Francisco, and Rio de Janeiro. I just picked five different places.
Yeah, one time I think I told you this. One time I was the global practice leader for a consulting company, and we had the challenge of when to schedule the global calls, because whatever you do, somebody is in their pajamas if you have a global business. And by the way, let me just take a moment to say I apologize to our friends in Asia. We know it's late in Shanghai. When we thought about setting up the series, we tried to figure out what's the best time for most of the alumni association. So we've kind of skewed it a little bit towards North America and Europe, and we apologize for that. The good news is everything is taped. So if there is a session that you're interested in and it's just too late and you don't like watching the webinars at 11 p.m. or at 8:30 at night in Delhi, please forgive us for scheduling it this way. But I do urge you to watch the tapes. By the way, Sebastian, India is half an hour difference. Now I understand that's it's got his historical reasons and such. Isn't that annoying?
It is, and so you probably want to double check when you schedule these calls. There's obviously also differences in terms of whether you're on daylight saving or not. There's certain areas which don't have that, right? We don't go switch back between daylight or not daylight saving. So these tools can help you calculate, but as you see in this example here on the screen, for example, if your team is stretched a fair bit, there's just very limited room for being able to connect and have everyone in the same call, right? Linking back to
I think some of our alum probably remember that case study that you and your colleagues teach about the guy with the team in India, and they have to go to all the meetings at night all the time, and they get annoyed after years and years of having the meetings at night all the time. So one thing that I learned when I was doing this is to move it around a little bit, and every now and again do something which it's late at night in Europe or late at night in the States, just to make everybody feel fair.
Yeah, exactly right. And the same applies to if you're sitting in the same city and you're remote working. If you feel that you scheduling your team calls every morning at 7 a.m. because it works well for you, doesn't mean that it necessarily works similarly well for every team member, right? So you can distribute those times a bit to make it fair for everyone too. So same thing.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So what else do you mean by this idea of depth perception? So this is time zones and geographic distance. What else is there?
Mm-hmm. Then there's also basically just how do you get work done, which I would call the operational distance, right? So you have the moment you work virtually, just as we do now, you can see yourself on screen, hopefully if you do video calls, but it's much more difficult to pick up on non-verbal cues, right? So there are more misunderstandings. We can go to very, very different cultural contexts, but you don't necessarily have to travel that far. Some of you might have seen this Anglo-Dutch translation guide here on the slide, which essentially just refers to different preferences, cultural preferences of how we communicate, right? And some cultures might talk more directly, others may speak less directly. The British are known for speaking at least less directly than the Dutch. You could also put the Germans here. And you get to quite some interesting misunderstandings. Here are a few examples, right? With all due respect, as the British might say, what they actually might mean is, I think you're wrong, I don't agree. And as a Dutch or German, this kind of supports you, right? They're listening to me. You carry on. Or the last one.
And this idea of cultural difference, and I know that you and your colleagues in the department, Yiting Li and others, make a big deal about this, and we spend a lot of time trying to help our students understand that you need to understand who's on the other side. But when you go virtual, does that accentuate these cultural differences, or does it make them go away, or what's the play as you take these cultural differences? And we all know that, Americans and Germans and Japanese and Chinese, we all think differently. But when you go virtually, what does that make it worse? Does that make it more important than ever? What's the impact?
So initially it makes it worse, just because it's more difficult to pick up on cues. You don't know why someone communicates the way he or she does. If you're on the ground, it's easier to do this, which means you have to define very clearly how you want to go about communicating. We can discuss and come back to this later, but essentially the idea is, if you don't define a very clear way of how we communicate, how we work together, people will revert back to what they're used to in their own culture background, even what they're used to in terms of their personal preference. And if you don't define a clear process, people will do what they prefer, right?
Yeah.
And
so what else? So we've got cultural differences, we've got time zones and geographic distance or operational distance.
You also have essentially, and this is working virtually, but also working from home specifically, is that you're juggling more different social roles, right? So you've here on the screen, but we're probably all experiencing this. You have your family living with you at home while you're trying to get work done. You may remember, I think a few years back, there was this BBC reporter in North Korea being alive, right? And one of his kids came storming to the room, longing for a cuddle. Well, in a way, we used to have much clearer boundaries between work, between our different roles. Now I'm a professor here in my home in Barcelona. I'm a father, I'm a husband. I'm caring for my parents at a distance. You're a friend, you're a colleague, you're doing all this at the same time, which means there's room for distractions, but it also just means that your different roles collide, which makes it more difficult to focus. And if you think a bit, again, about operational distance, if you want to focus on work, if you want to focus on one role very clearly, you need to be able to differentiate and then separate those. And that makes it more difficult when you're at home, when you're working virtually.
Sure, because virtual teams is everybody's online, but working at home is a whole nother level of complexity.
Exactly. And that's why you've seen the initial charts, right? It was much less prevalent up until now to really work from home and getting that right. So that's an additional challenge, yes.
Yeah. And what else do we have? Yeah.
And then I would also add, but as a leader, as a manager, it's tempting to think that people don't put in the same effort or time when they're working from home than the office, which is not necessarily true, but our temptation as a leader is often that we think that's not true. So you feel a lack of control. You can't just walk into your team member's office and check whether they're doing work. Right? So in a way, you also have that feeling that you can't monitor, control work being done.
One of our participants is saying, and one pitfall is lack of professional environment and a perception that maybe people aren't as productive at home.
Yeah.
Is that true? Are people more productive or less productive if they're home, or does it depend?
So it's interesting. It's a big debate. We've had some large companies. This was before the current crisis, going back to allowing remote work. So, for example, IBM a few years back decided that people would all have to come back to work because that's where innovation happens. People would be more productive. And I was working at that time with a executive in a fast-moving consumer goods company. A lot of line managers. This was a head of HR, and line managers would come to him and say, "Look, we also have to get our people back in the office. It makes much more sense. That's how we creative. We work much better." And then he used in a very clever way. He collected data. But he wanted to make an evidence-based decision that productivity would not suffer from working remotely. And so he looked at email patterns. He showed that people would actually work a lot on Fridays. He'd show that people took flights to Singapore on a Sunday to be able to meet your colleagues on a Monday morning. So people took personal preferences. Now, if you force people to go back on 9 to 5, 9 to 6 normal working day, and you don't allow them flexibility, whether they go the extra mile is not necessarily given, right? So we don't yet have evidence that working remotely is more productive, but it gives you additional benefits. And I think there's benefits that you can't have by just being present in the office. And so I think it depends. But to say
that's going to bring up another question, which I think we'll get to at the end of this. At the end of this thing is are we going to be able to go back to normal someday?
Yeah.
And what's that going to mean for leadership and managing teams and everything else? But so what else is there in this idea of depth, Sebastian? Just to finish up this chapter.
Yeah. So we've talked about virtual or geographical distance. We've talked about operational distance. And then the last bit is essentially your relationship distance, right? The very fact that you don't meet at the coffee bar, you can't connect that easily. Also just makes it more difficult to build and have high quality, deep relationships. And one reason for why this is so difficult is that you're essentially lacking shared context. You don't know exactly what it's like in each of your members' day-to-day realities, whether they're sitting in a different country, they're sitting at home, you don't know whether they have what family obligations they have, whether they have the right space to work in a similar way than the office. Now, the moment we don't exactly know what's happening in each team members or colleagues' day-to-day reality, we start guessing. And the moment we guess, we introduce bias, right? Here's just a visual kind of example of this, where we're essentially amplifying our cognitive biases when we don't share the same physical context. And so if someone makes a mistake, we very easily jump to perceiving this as incompetence, right? If you have different sub-teams, you mentioned the example earlier, right? So part of your team might be sitting in India, the other team might be sitting in Barcelona. Things go wrong once in India, all of a sudden the whole sub-team in India is incompetent, you can't rely on them, right? So we're starting to be biased, and because we don't have the same mutual knowledge of each other's context. So that's one thing.
That's the challenge. What do you do about this? What can we do to make virtual teams work better, to make people working virtually more effective? What are some of the ideas? And by the way, there's a whole bunch of questions and comments about tools. Mm-hmm. So as you talk about different things we can do, maybe you can also make some mention of the tools. I think this is probably not the right place to go through in a deep dive on all the different digital tools out there, but anything you can do to help with that, I think would be helpful.
Sure. So let me again break this down into the three categories that we've used just before. So if we start with geographic virtual distance, now I mean if you can simplify your team, if you have some say over this, do you really have to be stretched in different regional countries? That's a very simple thing. Maybe you don't have to. Maybe it makes more sense to split the team into two, and so you create more space to actually connect. Right? That's one thing. The other thing that you've already mentioned, just distributing meeting times more evenly, right? Doesn't always have to be 7 a.m. for you because it works for you as a leader, but maybe not for your team. But also just creating, especially for the leader, you have to be available, right? If you don't meet at the coffee counter, at the coffee bar, you have to make yourself available. You have to use different tools, what I would call rich technology, right? It's not just email and video calls. You can have instant messaging. You have Microsoft Teams. You've got different collaborative platforms that you can use to make sure that you have multiple points of contact, given that you're dispersed and you're in a virtual environment. So you're trying to collapse or overcome a bit that distance by creating more different points of contact.
So Sebastian, there's a question here, and it's triggered a thought. Is leadership different? Is the role of the leader and what we mean by leadership, does that get transformed in this virtual environment?
It's interesting, very interesting question. I mean, it's essentially the question is, how do you lead effectively when you're physically not there? And it comes back to, you have to be available as a leader. If you're never in the office in a face-to-face context, it's much more difficult to build informal influence, people right, believing you, they're wanting to follow you. The same applies in a virtual context. You have to make sure that you're available. Now, what we also see in a virtual context is that you probably have to distribute leadership responsibilities. If you want to take on all responsibilities yourself, the more dispersed your team, the more difficult it is. And so what you see in virtual teams happening often is that you slice responsibility in a different way. You have other people taking on certain leadership responsibilities for part of a project. So you're distributing some of this. So in a way, yes, leadership may look differently. You may be building and drawing on multiple people to lead the team effectively.
So what else can people do? What else can people do? Yeah.
The other, maybe on the operational distance, a very simple thing, and I think we've seen this now in the last few days, couple of weeks, is do you actually have the right infrastructure to get your work done? And I've seen some companies delivering your office chair to home, right? Just to make sure that you actually have an environment to work. If you're not used to working from home, do you have a screen? Can you get your screen from the office to home so you actually have an environment in which you can work effectively? These are simple things to make sure that you have the right infrastructure to get work done. The other is, if you really think about why we've been hesitant to adopt virtual and telework, is essentially that we have a different concept of how we would control work to be done. Right? I was working with a former EMBA alumni, French person who did the EMBA a couple of years ago, who founded the company Daisk.com. We had one of our past editions of IESE Insight, IESE Business School Insight, on the topic of space, the new frontier, goes a bit more to depth in that topic. What he did was found this company called Daisk, Daysk.com, and it's essentially the Airbnb of office space. Small equivalent of WeWork, Regis. So what they do would essentially is conference spaces, airports have rooms available. If you need an hour room, you don't want to sit in the airport lounge, you book that room. You can do this through an app. Great, but it's easy to do. You preload your app with money. You pay the room, and you can sit in whatever context. They did this originally for freelancers. Then they went to companies to offer this to companies, because you could offer your employees a perk to be working. If you can't work from home, or you don't want to always work from home.
It sounds like a great idea, but they're probably struggling right now because no one's traveling and everybody's home, right?
But at the moment, it's very difficult. But even before, they struggled to sell this to large companies, because companies would say, right, before we'd know that people were either in the office or that be at home. Now they could be anywhere. And as a leader, you don't like the fact that you don't know where your team members are. Sure. But I think the underlying issue is that we're still used to process control. We like to touch in and to see whether people get their work done. And I think we probably need to switch our mindset much more to real output-based control. And that means you need to trust people to get their work done. Sure. And I think Hemingway put it right. He said, well, the best way to see whether people can be trusted is to start trusting them. So
and Sebastian, all the things you're saying, there was a comment from one of we're talking about kind of normal virtual teams, but in this crisis mode, do they all still apply? Someone else wrote that his team is complaining that they just have too many conference calls and no time to get anything done because they're always on video conferences. Are the lessons from if you will, from more or less the gradual adoption of virtual teams to this emergency, can we talk about, which ones of those we have to do yes right away, and which ones of those maybe are not as applicable in these crazy times?
I think that's an important point to see whether we always have to be all in conference calls, right? So it is true, obviously, you were losing time because we have to schedule a call, make sure that it works for everyone. So I think that's why it's very important to also clarify your rules of engagement. So how do we work together? So for example, it has to be clear for your team when you might be more available. Beyond virtual calls, it's nice to see each other on the screen, but if you really want to touch base on an urgent issue, maybe you use instant messaging. Do we need to write emails or messages with a formal, dear Mike, I hope you have a good day? Or we can have one-line messages just to make sure this is the key issue. And that's how we
do we have to copy everybody on everything we send all the time?
Right, yeah.
Which is creating this snowball of emails.
Yeah. Now, if you don't define how we want to work together, then ultimately people will complain we have too many meetings. So it's also really prioritizing which are the important meetings, setting maybe a weekly touch base call with everyone. But it's very difficult to connect emotionally and when everyone is in the call, and then have individual calls between people, and then prioritizing what's the best way to touch base.
By the way, for those of you who are not aware, so IESE Business School has gone all online. Sandra Sieber was a member of the crisis team, which put together our online deployment, and she taped another one of these webinars a few days ago. It's available on LinkedIn. It's available on the YouTube channel and all the other places. So you can she can talk about IESE's experience, how we adopted and adapted to this new environment. In one of the first webinars we did on this whole topic, I discussed Patrick Lagadek's model of crisis management. And the fourth phase for him is called inventing. It's when you have to figure out how to do things in a different way. So there's a lot of other places to look for these. How do we go from where we were to where we are? And then I think the last question I have before we go to the other questions we have here for you, Sebastian, is how do you find common ground when you're so far away? How do you find that mesh? How do you get past this chart of not understanding people when you're actually in very different places?
I think that's important, specifically because despite these differences that we've already talked about, we have these perceived differences amongst each other as well. We're just at the moment doing research on people who work virtually, who switch between local and global roles, and we ask them to compare themselves with people who are in similar roles. And they would all say how they were essentially different from people in similar roles. So we perceive ourselves as different too. So you have all these differences playing roles. So how do you create common ground? Essentially, how do you create a shared narrative? I want to share what I think is a brilliant study. You see this here on the screen. This was a group of British researchers, and they were studying in 2005 under which conditions would you help a rival. And so, this being British researchers, they looked at two rival football teams. I thought this is timely because at the moment we're lacking. We don't have football, right? But essentially, what they did was they brought Manchester United fans on campus, had them sit in a room, and had them write down how long had they been Manchester United fans, how often would they watch Manchester United play, what does it mean for them to be a Manchester United fans. So they had these fans write this down. They left the room. They walked over the campus. And as they walked on the campus, there was a green pitch. And there was a runner running. The runner fell, cried out in pain, and held his ankle. And so the question was, would the Manchester United fans help the runner who just fell? And it turns out it depended on the T-shirt the runner was wearing. If he was wearing a Manchester United T-shirt, more than 80% helped. If he was wearing a white T-shirt, just like myself now, helping dropped down to 30%. And when he was wearing a Liverpool T-shirt of the rival football team, helping dropped even further. Now, that was not what the researchers wanted to understand, right? They wanted to understand under which conditions would you actually help a rival. So they do this again, the same experiment. They had Manchester United fans come on campus. They have them sit in a room, write down, how long have you been a football fan? How long have you been watching football matches? What does it mean for you to be a football fan? They leave the room. They walk over the campus. They see this runner run, fall, cry out in pain. Again, the question, would they help? Now, this time, wearing a Manchester United T-shirt helping stayed pretty much the same. Okay, very similar to the previous condition. Wearing a white T-shirt stayed around 30% as well, so not much change there. But this time, helping someone of your rival team wearing a Liverpool jersey, helping jump from 20 to 70%, which is a huge effect. By doing what? Essentially, the researchers asked these fans to think about the overarching whole rather than your own team.
Right? So what can a manager do, these days to really do that? How we're all home, everybody's worried. Some people have friends or family in the hospital. You're trying to keep the team together. What can you do to build common ground today in this environment?
So one is we actually have a huge opportunity at the moment to bring the team together. We're all sitting in the same boat. We're all juggling different social roles. We're all working from home. So actually, even if your team is dispersed, we're actually much more similar than we were 2 weeks ago. So one is actually the current situation is helping us to do this. We probably just want to make that explicit. The other is you as a leader, if you convey stress and helplessness, we know that emotions are contagious. You're also infecting others. So if you can show confidence and you're conveying that to the team and you're bringing this into sense of urgency and see how we can get through this together. That's also another way to get the team behind you, right? Another way is
yeah, sure.
Also when you have these touch-in calls, I think it's a nice idea to see how everyone's doing, and if you see that everyone has their own struggles, and we all see that each team member has slightly different struggles given the current situation, that's also a way to create similarities and common ground. To see, it's very powerful to see that everyone has their own challenges in making this work, but listening and hearing about these similarities can help your team brought together as well.
Now, should people do that? This probably depends on the specific situation in the country and the culture of the company, but do you think leaders should be reaching out to people to make sure they understand what's going on, or should they be inviting people in some kind of a forum to be talking with each other, or both?
And exactly as you say, I think that depends on the culture context. It also depends on the team. If you have a new team where people might be less forthcoming, people might be feeling less safe to speak up, then maybe you do this with individual calls, which I think you have to do anyway. But beyond the team calls, the video calls, you want to check in individually with your team. I think you don't even have to be in all the calls yourself as leader. If you can encourage your team members interacting in pairs, either during work or outside work context, to have them share some of their concerns or challenges, but also how they're feeling. You don't need to.
I'm kind of moving into the questions here.
Yes.
Jose Garcia is asking: is there a need for more structure because of this situation? Do we need to really, I don't know, add more structure than we had before because we're in this environment, and kind of regiment what the day looks like and who's on which call, et cetera, or is it more decentralized, or both?
I think it's actually both. So in a way, you need structure. You need to have your core working hours. Essentially, it's the same as if you organize your vacation days in your company. It can't happen that everyone is going on holiday at the same time. If you're working remotely, you can't have everyone looking after the kids or doing something else at the same time if you need to work on an urgent issue. So you need to define core working times where you can touch base, where if something comes up, you work together. And so you have to define those. But you also have to be flexible, knowing that some of your team members might connect at night, because that's when they get the rest of the work done. And so you have to be flexible to allow that. And if you want to be able to connect with each of your team members during 10 hours any time, that may not happen just because of the current situation. So I think it's both.
And Sebastian, could you talk a little bit about the tools? There's a bunch of questions about the tools. And by the way, I'm trying to follow it with one eye. There's a very long and very rich chat discussion of different people suggesting different tools to each other. I'm using this, I'm using that. You can get it for free, this kind of stuff. Do you have any lists of favorite tools or favorite types of tools, or a typology of tools, or something you can offer?
I mean, I think one of the challenges is that there's a lot of tools. So I don't see the chat now. I think for video calls, there's different advantages depending on what you want to do. Some technologies like Zoom, Skype for Business, also Microsoft Teams, some allow you to record meetings, for example, which can be very helpful if not everyone is on the call. Some tools don't allow you. So for example, Zoom works very well. Microsoft Teams recently has done that too. Skype for Business doesn't do this very well. So if you need to record certain aspects of meetings, because not everyone can do it, but so that defines a bit your video conference tools. And then there's a lot of other collaborative tools. Sometimes there's preferences. I was currently working with a big tech company, having taken over another tech company, and the two companies had vastly different preferences for collaborative tools. The acquirer used Microsoft tools. The acquired firm used Slack, and they were literally fighting over which tools to use. Ultimately, I think it's being used to them, but what you don't want to do is jumping between tools all the time. Give people a way to get used to the tools, get to know them, get to know the functionality, and then use them consistently.
And then if I can interject, Sebastian, here at the business school, and Sandra Sieber again talks about this at some length in her video from last week. Most of us have been trained on doing this kind of stuff with WebEx, and we went to Zoom. And she actually talks about the reason we went to Zoom. And one of the reasons was we really felt we needed outside support to massively adopt the tools, and our provider had Zoom. The other part of the story is we have students who are already in China, and we needed a tool which can actually do quality virtual work from China. And Zoom had that, and some of its competitors didn't. So there's a lot of stuff in this box, and I think it's really something worth looking at. Another bunch of questions have to do with kind of what I said earlier, or what I asked earlier, which is, what's different about these times? Because over the last 30 days, I think England went into lockdown today. So many of people are going through this now for the first time or the second time, or just a couple of weeks into this. Is the emergency different? Are there fundamental things which we need to pay attention to as managers and leaders, which are different in the virtual environment during the emergency compared to, say, I'm moving my conference calls online, back in the day?
Yeah, and I mean, I think particularly it's important to not downplay the relational part, right? It's very tempting to see, okay, we're in this crisis situation, we need to get our work done. So we focus on the operational distance, but we don't focus enough on the relationships. You need to make sure that people are in touch, but it boils down to trust. We can trust people because we know they have a certain expertise, and that's what research actually tells us, that you can trust someone very quickly in a virtual environment because you know that person has a certain expertise. But over time, and it looks like we'll be confined to our homes for some time, we need to we have to have a sustainable way to also have deeper relationships, right? And so as a tool, I would also define, how do you make sure that people connect with each other? I've seen teams having virtual reward ceremonies, for example, right? You send a small token gift, you get on a call, you open it and celebrate because you've reached a milestone.
Oh, that's nice.
After work beer or get together, we can go to our fridge, open a bottle of beer, get on a call for 10 minutes and celebrate.
Or maybe you and I can do that after this call.
Well, we will for sure.
I have a class for the MBA, but maybe after the MBA.
We'll do it afterwards. We'll do it later. But so I think these are very important tools. You can play online games if you can agree on a game that works well for everyone you like. You just want to create contact points outside of your key task, your key work. Right? And so I think those are very important tools. It's very tempting. We think about tools only, the tech tools, and that's where we end. Now we also need to invest in the relationships.
Now, there's a very specific question about the performance assessment in this environment. Setting goals. I mean, is it okay for managers to tell people what to do, to tell people what's expected? And there was a question very early in the call, in the chat, about how do you sell online?
Yeah, it is the same challenge, right? How do you connect? If your sales job is a high touch meeting clients, then you have to replicate that in a virtual environment as well. And I think you can do this, but you want to think very carefully about the channel. So what's the best channel for talking to your client? How can you back up? How can you support what you're doing virtually in the conversation by sending additional materials? You can still do that, but it's not one-on-one, but you can replicate as much as possible that environment. And you probably still want to maintain different points of contact with your clients as you would with your employees too.
And then performance reviews and even difficult conversations. Can you have difficult conversations in this environment?
Important question, because if we're confined for longer at home, we probably will have those conversations. And I think you can, but you want to think very carefully how you raise this topic. So if you have a call with multiple people, you can't raise too difficult issues because you can't follow up on them. You need time to work through them. So again, you want to think about what's the best channel. It's probably a one-on-one video call to have a difficult, tough conversation or performance review. You want to make sure that you can follow up. You have instant messaging. You have different tools that you can use to follow up on questions that may arise after that conversation.
I guess, Sebastian, just like you wouldn't want to have a fight in a public meeting. Yeah, if you saw that someone was hot, you'd maybe call a break and say, "Hey, Joe, can you have a cup of coffee with me?" Or you try to calm things down. I guess in this kinds of, so you have to be careful not to let the chat get out of hand, or not to let not to let someone make a speech, and if they do, try to channel it somehow, just like you would in real life.
Yeah, but at the same time, I would say having a bit of disagreement in calls is a good thing, right? If our new normal is that we are on these calls and everyone's just waiting for the call to end and no one brings in new ideas, we'd be running out of new insights very soon. So if you're concerned about this, you'd almost want to model a bit of disagreement, right? So let's have a bit of a debate with the caveat that you've mentioned, right? Let's not get this out of hand. We have half an hour. Let's use that time to think about new ideas. Let's brainstorm, and then let's stop, and then we can follow up through different channels or different tools to keep that going.
By the way, someone's asking if there's a guide for virtual teams. Is there a book they should get? Do you have a guide? Is there some kind of really good reference material that you would recommend?
There's several very nice articles, so we can share those. Let me check whether we can share those through the alumni.
I'm sure you can. I'm sure you can.
Yeah. So
okay, fantastic. Now, so I guess the last bunch of questions, and there's 3 or 4 different ones, which all get at the same thing, is and what after this? We're going to get through this. It's going to last 6 weeks or whatever. I understand China is opening up the subway in Wuhan. China is getting back to work. South Korea is back to work. The numbers look good from Italy. So there is, we're starting to see kind of light at the end of the tunnel. What does that mean for this whole virtual environment? Will we just say, okay, turn it all off, put the camera away and go back to work? Or are we going to get to some kind of new hybrid, new normal? What do you think?
So I think we will see an increase in virtual work, just because now in many ways we were forced in very little time to build up our capabilities and our infrastructure. The thing is, often we change personally when we're forced to, when we're with the back against our wall, right? Where you're forced, you create new habits. It's very difficult to change new habits, but now we've been forced to do that because we know we're at least for a few more days or a couple of weeks confined. So you have to get going with this new routine. And I think that's actually a positive thing. But the moment you actually start changing your habit and adopt virtual working, even though you may be going back to going to the office afterwards, you have expanded your repertoire, right? You've broadened your capacities, and you may in the future have different channels of how you connect with people, how you communicate with parts of your team. It'd be a shame if we forget that capacity and we lose that capacity. So I believe that I think we're investing in that, and that will expand our competence and capabilities for the future. The other thing I will say is, if you really think about how we are currently working, then a lot of our job descriptions, our work design is still very antiquated. We've adapted where we had to, and I think that the biggest experimentation that we see is in startups. That's where you see companies completely redesigning how we should be working. I think the current crisis has forced us to rethink how we should be working. And my positive hope would be that this triggers a bit more rethink and adapting how we're slicing work, how we're designing work for the future. And if that would be the case, I think we'd actually gain something out of all this.
Fantastic. Sebastian Reiche, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to our people today. There's lots more questions. I wish we had time to get to all of them. There are questions about labor law. There's questions about body language. If you and your colleagues in the department want the material to make another technical note or to work on this stuff, there's a lot of stuff available. Now remember, this session is, if you know anybody who you think needs to watch it, is available on the LinkedIn feed. It'll be there to watch later. It's going to be on the different websites of IESE Business School and on our YouTube channel. Tomorrow, again at 4 o'clock in here in Barcelona, Central European time, at 11 a.m. in New York, 11 p.m. in Shanghai, and 11 a.m. in New York City. Tomorrow we have Professor Iago de la Cierva. He's going to be talking about communication. He will be speaking in Spanish. But most of these sessions will be done in English. I think there's another one scheduled for Thursday. And on Monday, I have another one with Jaume Rivera talking about supply chains. So please stay tuned to this channel. We're not done yet. And again, if you want to watch anything in past or send it to somebody, you'll see this and many, many more things on IESE's resource page at www.iese.edu. thanks very much for tuning in, and please, everybody, stay safe, keep well, and good luck.